Okay, welcome to today's live stream for the second time. I'm hoping to have audio this time. I'm going to let everybody know that the stream is going on right now. So I'm going to try to see if I can get things going again. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. Thank you, Melissa. I'm glad that you are a huge fan of the channel. I'm glad that you watched the channel. I had some technical difficulties a minute ago because I was listening to some MP3s before I got started. But I'm going to try to get everything going now. I wasn't really paying attention to that episode, Mayhem, about Green Arrow. I was busy doing other things. I'm going to get into the topic in a minute because I had a little technical difficulties, but I'm going to get into today's live stream topic, which is about ComicsGate. And do people in ComicsGate and the comic book industry, are they interested in solutions? And that's a critical question I have to ask both sides, ComicsGate supporters and people in the comic book industry, because when I look at their behaviors and I look at the pattern of their behaviors, I'm not seeing people who are focused on solutions. Now, in the beginning, I was a supporter of ComicsGate because I thought that they were all about things as related to improving the quality of the stories in comic books and establishing some sort of standard as related to comic books. And as a comic fan, ever since I was 4 years old, this was something that I was passionate about because I've always aspired to be a comic book writer ever since I was about 9 years old. And it was something I always wanted to do. And that's one of the reasons why I trained to become a professional writer, was because I always aspired to write comic books. And I thought that ComicsGate was all about trying to improve the quality of comics. But over the last year and the last couple of months, I'm beginning to see a pattern emerge as related to both ComicsGate and the comic book industry that I've seen happen before. Now, before we had ComicsGate, we had the comic book industry, which was stuck in what I see as a vicious cycle. And this vicious cycle is where the comic book industry creates these stories. People start buying the first issue by the top talented team. And then after that team leaves, then a secondary team comes on, the sales of the book decline. And then we see what happens is we get these people starting to get, these creators starting to get frustrated, the editors starting to get frustrated, and the stories start falling apart. Then we have yet another reboot, and we've had this vicious cycle transpire at Marvel Comics, DC Comics, Dynamite, Image, and even some of the indies, where many of the properties wind up getting rebooted over and over again, and nothing really is focused on getting any sort of consistent change in the industry that will help it become more stable and help it grow as a business. Because when I look at the state of your ComicsGate these days, it's really not really about focusing on solutions. It's just about going around and around in a circle, which is starting to become a vicious cycle. And this vicious cycle is seeming like it's rooted in a codependent pattern where we have on one side these so-called SJW comic pros, and then we have people who are a part of ComicsGate, and they spend more time bickering and arguing with each other instead of trying to work towards any sort of constructive change. And when I look at the videos and stuff, it's more about people going back and forth with each other rather than focusing on any sort of solution whatsoever. So that's one of the issues I have with ComicsGate these days, because I thought that this was all about improving the quality of the comics, improving the quality of the stories, and getting quality stories in the hands of readers. Unfortunately, over the last year, we have not seen any sort of serious focus on trying to get stories in the hands of new readers. Instead, what we have gotten is people continuing to make YouTube videos where they continue to complain about bad comics, and they are just sitting there going back and forth on places like Twitter with these so-called SJW comics pros. And that, to me, is not something that I see as constructive. Now, as a publisher, I want to focus on doing things that are constructive, because when I go out here and I take my time to put my fingers to a keyboard for a book, what I want to do is create a quality product for my customers in the quest of getting sales and building an audience with my customers. That is the main goal I have as a publisher. I have no interest in getting into a back and forth with people over what they don't like about a book, because to me, getting into a back and forth is not constructive. If you want to improve the quality of a product, you are going to make constructive criticisms about a product, and you're going to offer solutions that will help move that product forward. And that's not something, again, I am seeing as related to ComicsGate, nor is it something I am seeing as related to these so-called SJW comics pros who, again, are just sitting there complaining about comics and not really working towards offering any solutions. Now, as a publisher, again, when I do critiques of comics, when I do a critique of a comic, it is not to attack the person on an ad hominem level. It is to talk about things as related to structure of storytelling and things as related to the form of the medium. Like last week, I did a critique of The Magnificent Ms. Marvel. And what was sad to me with that book was, even though they had a brand new writer in Saladin Ahmed and a new artist and a brand new #1, we still got the same dysfunctional content. And I believe that in some ways, this is being done on purpose, because when it comes down to many of these people in the comic book industry, they are so caught up in trying to get the ComicsGate audience and the attention from the ComicsGate audience that they are not really focusing on creating a constructive solution that will allow them to expand their audience. And that, to me, again, is not good business sense, because any good business person, they are not going to sit there and just do things to try to goad people into making videos and trying to get a YouTube crowd who really don't buy comics. What they're going to do is try to create products that try to appeal to the casual audience, because the casual audience, that's where the real money is. Because when it comes down to comics these days, again, the median age of your comic book reader is my age, 45 years old. And when you have multinational conglomerates and you have a company with a median age of 45, that's when companies start thinking about discontinuation of that product, because that customer has one foot in the grave and another foot on a banana peel. So they have no way of ever trying to upsell any new products to customers, because that's not going to make them any money. Older customers don't make businesses money. Younger customers make businesses money, because back in 1987, when I was 13 years old, the median age of a comic book reader was 13 years old. And at 13 years old, the industry had no place but to go but up, because the audience was getting younger. And the whole thing is, you not only had the kids of my generation, but you also had the Gen Ys, and you also could have had the millennials. Unfortunately, the big problem in comic books was the fact that we really don't have any leadership at the so-called big two comic publishers. And that's the other big problem I see with this industry, in that that prevents us from getting solutions, is that we don't have a seasoned publishing professional running things at your Marvel Comics and your DC Comics. Your Dan Dido at DC, he has absolutely no publishing experience, and your Sana Amanat over at Marvel has no publishing experience. And because both people have no publishing experience, this is why a lot of the comics being published these days are absolute garbage. Because a publishing professional, because they have experience in publishing trade material, what they're going to do is they're going to set some sort of standard. And when I look at the comics being produced at your Marvel, your DC, your Image, your Dynamite, and even some of your indies, I just don't see any sort of consistent standard. And the sad part is, I don't see anybody working towards developing any sort of consistent standard. And instead of people talking about working towards the goal of developing a consistent standard, what I'm seeing instead with this whole ComicsGate thing is people more about getting caught up in the conflict, like Hardcore H just mentioned. And it's all about them, again, getting into this vicious cycle where they make the bad comics and then the comic skaters attack it. And again, that is a vicious cycle. And I started to notice that vicious cycle start a couple of weeks ago when I launched the ISIS graphic novel Indiegogo. I let a lot of people know, even some comic skaters know, that I was doing this Indiegogo, and nothing but silence. But the minute your Kwanzaa comes out with this book called White, I started to see the pattern of codependency emerge and the vicious cycle start, because everybody wanted to make videos about your Kwanzaa and they wanted to get into a back and forth with him. And again, I thought again that a lot of people who were making these crowdfunded comics, they were interested and eager towards improving the quality of comics by going out here and producing quality stories that they complain that the big two and major publishers aren't producing. And I thought they were eager about focusing on a constructive solution. But when I saw them going out here and making multiple videos about Kwanzaa, that's when I started to see the same pattern of dysfunction I started to see in the Black community as related to these pro-Blacks, who oftentimes are the ones sitting there talking about the evil white man and then talking about how we need to build our own. And then when you actively go to them and say, hey, I'm here and I'm ready to build my own and I'm ready to go and take care of business, these same people then want to go out here and give you excuses as to why they can't support anything that you want to do. So I see the same dysfunctional codependent pattern in Comicsgate that I saw in Pro Blacks a couple of years ago. And if you're going to go down that road, it's a very dangerous road to go down, because that road is one that's going to go nowhere. And when you have a business like that that's going nowhere, that's why we have the problems that are escalating in the comic book industry as it continues to decline, instead of things making efforts towards any sort of constructive change. Because that's a good point, Hardcore H. Yeah, Kwanzaa is a perfect example. And he said that they were helping him market his book. Yeah. And if Comicsgate is supposed to be about, again, solutions, again, why would you continue to give more money to an individual who is making the kind of comic you say you don't like? And again, that's the hallmark of mental illness right there. If you're going to make a video about a guy whose books you say are terrible and you don't like, and then you're going to go out here and actually back those same books, that's not something any business person who will do, and that's not something anybody who is truly interested in seeing the industry grow is going to do. They're not going to go out here and help the guy who is dysfunctional continue to remain dysfunctional, because as I see it, that's a form of enabling, and enabling behavior, that's something that that's not what a healthy, functional person is going to do. They're not going to sit there and continue to enable the same behaviors that they don't like. And they're not going to continue to support the products that they say that they don't like, because only codependent people are going to do that. Because when it comes down to a codependent person, they're in a codependent relationship, you have two people. You have the victim and you have the abuser. And the abuser, what they will do is try to provoke the victim, and then the abuser will then lash out at the victim will lash out at the abuser, and then the abuser will sit there and say, "Oh, you hurt me, I'm a victim." And then what will happen is they get into this vicious cycle where they keep pointing the finger at each other, and instead of them trying to have a healthy, interdependent relationship, they just keep going back and forth with each other, blaming each other for the problems each other causes. And when you have that type of behavior, it just is a toxic situation to be in, and it's a toxic situation that this comic book industry, as I see it, is growing and becoming more and more. Because again, if you want solutions, you are going to work towards solutions, and you're going to focus on solutions. And again, when I started out a couple of years ago and I was looking at Comicsgate and they were complaining about the books, I actually read some of the books and I saw how terrible they were. And again, I thought that people were serious about change, because at the 2017 Comic-Con, you had all these comic shop owners who confronted Marvel's leadership and demanded better comics. And I thought we were going to move in a forward direction. Unfortunately, instead of moving in a forward direction, I saw, again, the passive aggressiveness in the products they produced. Because yes, they gave you Steve Rogers back as Captain America, Tony Stark as Iron Man, and Odinson as Thor, and Peter Parker as Spider-Man, that the comic skaters demanded. And passively but aggressively, I saw this whole pattern where they went out here and then continued to push the same identity politics to people and the same victimization narrative. So instead of making a conscientious effort to give the customer what they wanted, instead it became about, I'm going to give you what I like and you're just going to take it. And again, that's just not what a healthy, interdependent business person does in a business situation. They do not sit there and just attack the customer, and the customer themselves doesn't just keep playing this back and forth game with them, because that's something that, again, business people don't do. And yeah, Hardcore H, the same thing can be said about Captain Marvel, because people made all these videos complaining about Brie Larson instead of not going to watch. And then they went out here and they bought tickets to this movie and made it more about going to see how bad the movie was. And again, that's codependency. It's not about solution. Again, you want to send a message about how bad this movie is, you would do like the comic fans did in 2004 with Catwoman, where you're going to say, okay, they're not making the movie I want to see. I need to send a message and not go see that movie. That's what an interdependent comic fan did back in 2004. But in today's bit market, I just see, again, dysfunction, because all these people who complained about Captain Marvel, made all these videos about Captain Marvel, they went out here and spent money to go see Captain Marvel, instead of doing what I did, which is saying, okay, this is a terrible movie, and I started to see a decline in quality. I need to not spend my money on this movie. And again, it's just, they sat there and made all these videos complaining about it, but then if you go out here and buy tickets to it, all you're doing is sending a message to the Disney Corporation that it's okay to keep making more Captain Marvel movies. And that's something, again, that fits right within the dysfunction that I'm seeing, because again, I see this codependent pattern that came from the comics starting to now emerge in the MCU. Because in the MCU, again, we had all these people complaining about Brie Larson and Captain Marvel. Now it's going to be $1 billion film, and again, now Disney's going to have the reinforcement by the money and the numbers to say, okay, we're going to just keep having Captain Marvel be the flagship character of the MCU because she continues to make money for us. And again, that's a really troubling thing, especially when I think about how your James Gunn was rehired by your Disney to go out here and direct your Guardians of the Galaxy 3. Your James Gunn, a man who made numerous jokes about pedophilia and child rape. Your Disney just decides to bring him back because, one, they have no respect for the comic fans. Two, they have no respect for the customer. And three, they have no moral position, because to bring back this type of man to a family company that purports to be about producing family entertainment, that is nothing more than a middle finger up at all of those customers who say that they want family entertainment. Because to bring this man in here who is talking about things like pedophilia and child rape on social media, to bring him back all because you say you want to go out here and make this movie, it's one of the things that really, it just made me feel disturbed. I was just disturbed by it, because it just shows how sick things are. I mean, people are so obsessed with seeing the next MCU movie that they're leaving their morals at the door. They're leaving their values at the door. And that's something, again, that it should be troubling to people, because if you can sit there and watch a James Gunn Guardians 3, that says something about you, because it just says that there's something wrong with your character. If you can sit there and say, I want to watch a movie by a guy who made this and pay money to go see this, it says something that's really wrong with you. And that just is really troubling. And the hypocrisy is that, you have your Surviving R. Kelly coming out, and they're talking about how bad R. Kelly is, but then you want to give this huge pass to James Gunn. And again, that really, it really is troubling to me when I see these so-called comic skaters. Many of them, they're not really coming out to denounce your James Gunn. And many people who are MCU fans, they're not coming out to denounce your James Gunn. No, all they want to do is get their next superhero movie fix. And again, that shows how deeply troubling things are as related to this industry and related to many of the people on both sides, your Comicsgate and your so-called SJW Comics Pros, and even your filmmakers at the Disney Corporation. What I find to be quite troubling is that people are so emotionally invested in these characters that they aren't thinking about, again, the immoral actions of the Disney Corporation. Because when I look at what they did with James Gunn and Guardians 3, it's very similar to what your Kathleen Kennedy did at Lucasfilm with the whole Star Wars franchise. But thankfully, many of the Star Wars fans at least said, we have a standard for Star Wars, we have a moral position on Star Wars, and we see the things that you're trying to push in Star Wars. And a lot of them just said, no, we're not going to see Solo. And they didn't go see Solo, and they made that movie flop because they didn't like things like them trying to rewrite Han Solo's story, and things like trying to promote this pansexuality, or as I call it, sexual deviancy in Lando Calrissian, when he's out here talking about having a relationship with that L33 whatever it is. And again, that's just, again, it flies in the face of the Lando Calrissian character, and it didn't stay consistent to the story, and people stood up and walked away. But when I'm looking at this Comicsgate, I'm not seeing that kind of pushback. Instead, I see this, again, codependent relationship that is reforming and becoming this vicious cycle that's repeating itself. Because for people to say they want solutions, they don't seem like they're acting like they want solutions. Instead, what they are doing is sitting there talking out about the problem again and again, instead of really dealing with it. Because when I look at all these comic shops that still continue to close, it shows me again, nobody is working on any sort of solution. And that's one of the things that, again, is quite troubling, because if this industry is in dire straits, like everybody has been saying in countless videos, you would think you would be working on trying to save those stores, because that the problem is, they, even after that 2017 confrontation, the behaviors still go on. It's like, oh, in 2017, all these comic shop owners confronted Marvel, and then your Marvel, after being confronted, did a little bit, but then didn't really make any efforts towards any sort of change. And that's similar to what codependent people like alcoholics and drug addicts do. The parents or the people will have an intervention, give them an ultimatum. The person will try to call themselves cleaning up in the beginning, and then later on, right back to the exact same dysfunctional, addictive behaviors once again. So that's one of the other things I see as related to this whole Comicsgate thing, and which was, again, supposed to be all about trying to improve conditions in the comic book industry. And that's something that I'm not seeing any sort of progress being made. I don't see it on the Marvel side, and I also don't see it on the DC side, where over 15 years ago, we had your Dan Dido coming into DC. And again, this is a man with no publishing experience. He's coming into the industry. And the first thing this man wants to talk about with the graduation day, he kills off Donna Troy. But the big thing that really made me believe that this man should never have been picked to be the publisher of DC Comics was what he did in the storyline Identity Crisis, when he said, we need a rape in a comic. And with comic books being family entertainment for children, that's something that if I was running Warner Brothers, the first thing I'm going to do is say, it's time to terminate this guy, because he's saying that we need sexual violence in a comic, and that's something that is just not appropriate for superhero comics. And even worse than the rape, which was horrific, of Sue Dibney. We have these heroes acting out of character and are extremely unethical. I mean, just this is supervillain behavior when I look at it. With Identity Crisis, where they mind wipe Batman and mind wipe Dr. Light. Again, this was a disgusting story that led to the decline of DC Comics. And over 15 years, we've had your Dan Dido at DC run DC straight into the ground. And instead of people, again, trying to facilitate any sort of serious change, we get the same, again, codependent pattern we see at Marvel, where they will do something like Convergence and Rebirth to try to straighten things up and then return right back to the same dysfunctional behavior, just like an alcoholic or a drug addict. And they just really, again, go right back to the same dysfunction, and it's quite troubling. So that's something that, again, I saw over at the DC side. I see over at the Marvel side. I even see it at Dynamite, where they were just constantly rebooting the characters. And again, no real effort towards any sort of change. It's about, Hardcore H makes another good point. It's like they're about making money and getting popular, but again, never making any efforts to do things like what I want to do with SJS Direct and what I wanted to do with my Indiegogo. I wanted to, again, create a model for a new story paradigm. I wanted to do things like try to bring in some of the casual readers. And I wanted to build that bridge among comic fans to start working towards constructive action, towards fixing some of the problems by offering readers a chance at a old school style comic that would be all ages, family friendly, and try to bring people together with comics, not just make a fast dollar for myself. Because for me, it's not just about making money. It's about trying to get people to see what's great about the medium, see what's great about the stories, and see what's great about the storytelling. So it's not, to me, it's not just about the money. It's about trying to create a product that shows that it is possible to create comics that meet a standard for quality and a standard, and establish a standard as related to storytelling and a standard for story models. Because the same standards I use for many of my SJS Direct books, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, and my nonfiction books like Stop Simpin' and The Man Crisis, that's what I planned to put into my ISIS graphic novel. That's what I want. That's what I'm planning to put into it. And if you, any book that you get from SJS Direct that is top quality and is out there, you're going to get that same standard of quality. Because when I go out here and I publish a book, I make sure that if it's a nonfiction book, the subject is researched, like I did with The Man Crisis, where it's researched to the point where I have many people, even people on doctoral levels, saying that this book is one of the best out there. I have people in the MGTOW community saying that this book is one of the best out there. And I have many men out here saying that this is one of the best books out there in nonfiction. And when I do my fiction, like my ISIS series or my John Haynes series or my E-Steam series, I often, again, make sure that those books are the highest quality. So when I go out here, I want to make sure that there's a standard as related for storytelling and a platform that can be built that can be a place to bring those new readers in and try to bring back some of the passion to comics, because I really love comics. I've been reading, again, comics since I was 4 years old. It was the way I learned how to read. And that's one of those things that, again, it was a major part of my life. So that's something that was a major part of my life. And it's a part of my life that I always wanted to share with people, again, since I was 9 years old. And I always wanted to make comics. But again, because I could not draw very well, I would write the stories in words to create the pictures. And what I want to do is create those, show you how the pictures I design would work in a comic book story. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to support ComicsGate. But these days, I'm looking at the whole situation. Again, it's just not what I consider to be constructive action. I don't see a constructive course in constantly going back and forth with so-called SJW comics pros, and I don't see a constructive course with people continuing to go out here and continue to launch bad comics on purpose and waste company resources and waste precious time. Because when I look at this industry, we are wasting a lot of precious time because these comic shops out here, they are hanging on by a thread due to all of the bad product. And what's really, again, sad about everything is we are in the middle of the biggest superhero and comic book movie boom, and no one is focused on the business of capitalizing on this business. And again, there is money to be made and money on the table, but because most comic skaters, comic pros, and even some comic shop owners are so caught up in their own feelings about things, they are not really focused on the paper and the bottom line, the money on the table and the bottom line. And Hardcore H makes another great point. And yeah, the independent circle, which is where I am right now in books, is where we'll get entertainment. And yeah, the channels grow on conflict, but that's all flash as I see it. I'm more focused on substance because a lot of people say I could have gotten, 20,000, 30,000 subs by presenting emotional tirades and emotional displays. But to me, I value quality. I value substance. And I'm not seeing any sort of substance here as related to the comic book industry. I'm not seeing any sort of, again, focus on quality. I'm not seeing any focus on any sort of course to set towards getting towards standards. Now, even when I made a while back, I made a couple of videos about, the state of the comic book industry. And I often talked about what I would do if I were an editor-in-chief, because I see comics as still a viable medium. And again, I see the big problem with comics having to do with leadership, because the big problem is we don't have anybody in the industry who understands the standards as related to publishing. Hey, Hanfizi student. Hi, Omio. I saw you back there, but I was just going and talking about this whole situation. And I don't see, we need a publishing professional, because again, a publishing professional from a trade house, they're going to establish standards. And when they have standards, it's a completely different game, because in trade publishing, everything is about making sure that the books are top quality. Moreover, it's also about making sure that you're going to produce a product that's going to sell. So those are the two things that are important to a trade publishing house, whether they produce, again, a nonfiction book or a romance novel. They are going to make sure that this book is going to, one, have a core audience, and two, once they make sure it has a core audience that they're going to target, they are going to make sure that this book is of the highest quality. So they're not going to sit there and just publish anything for the sake of publishing, like I've seen at Marvel, I've seen at DC, I've seen even at Dynamite and Image. They just sit there and they just publish stuff that really, I'm sitting there and I would ask myself, what audience is this for? What customer is this for? Who is the core audience? Who is the target audience? And what did the writer hope to present to the reader when they proposed this project? Because in a trade publishing house, you have to first send them a query letter, which is usually 1 page, detailing what the project is about. And you have to, in that letter, you have to detail what audience you're going for in order for that editor or that agent to even look at your sample chapters or your synopsis. And I look at a lot of these comics, like I looked at the entire launch of Vertigo, I didn't see any sort of focus as related to standards. I looked at all those books from Border Town to Hex Wives to the higher level, or whatever it was called. I didn't see anything as related to a product focused on targeting an audience, nor did I see anything as related to any sort of content that was quality. You make another good point, Hardcore H, but I don't see how you can make a franchise out of anything if you don't have any quality material. I mean, this is where where Marvel and DC are going to run into trouble in a couple of years. Is they're sitting there talking about they want to make franchises and movies, but if you don't have good stories, which is the source of everything, you're not going to have any way to make films. You're not going to have any way to make TV shows, because screenwriters, what we work on is the source material when we're adapting the material. And in order to make an adaptation, you have to have quality source material. And when I look at a lot of these comics, if you try to make films out of them, they're going to be extremely terrible films. And that's one of the reasons why the DC franchise fell completely apart, because it was based on Dan Dido's New 52 and the dark story model of the New 52 and Zack Snyder's Dark Vision. And the whole thing crumbled into dust because the story and the source material was weak. And because the story and the source material was weak, the adaptation was absolutely terrible. I don't know, Dog King. When I look at DC, it's not anywhere near where it was in the 80s or the 90s. When I look at DC from the post-crisis and the 90s, it was a lot stronger than it is right now. I mean, DC, especially when I look at Tom King's Batman and your Brian Michael Bendis' Superman, it's really in a weak place. And yeah, Marvel has been in this vicious cycle where they just run a series for 25 issues, and that's related to their editorial. And their editorial is one of the big problems at Marvel, because they've had trouble with their editorial ever since about 2000, 2001, when they had the Heroes Return reboot, and that was on its way to going strong around the 36th issue of many of those books. And they were looking to transition to new creative teams, because guys like Kurt Busiek, George Perez, Sean Chen, they were getting ready to wrap up their runs. And instead, because Marvel's editorial was incompetent, they weren't thinking about setting up a smooth transition. And because they couldn't set up the smooth transition, that's when all of those books started to decline in sales. They brought in a lot of really bad writers like your Frank Thierry on Iron Man and Aletha Martinez, and they tanked Iron Man from being a top book and an Iron Man being a top character. They came in along with Joe Quesada in that Sentient Armor storyline. They derailed that book. We had your Dan Jurgens coming on, Captain America. He didn't really do his research, and that book started to decline in sales. Plus, the art on there got really uninspired after you look at what Wade and Garney did. And then you had Avengers, which had Busiek and Perez. Perez left, and Busiek was there until about issue 60 in a meandering Kang storyline that just fell apart. And then we got disassembled, and then we got another reboot. And again, that was a problem due to editorial not having a vision for what they planned to do after the superstar teams came on. And that's been the problem at Marvel, even though they've gone through different editors-in-chief, such as Joe Quesada, your Axel Alonso, and now your C.B. Cebulski. They've had this vicious cycle of launching series for 24 issues, the book declining in sales, and then going out here and the book being rebooted. And what was really troubling that showed me this vicious cycle was with Daredevil. We had Mark Waid and Chris Samney. They did an amazing run on Daredevil. It was still strong and selling strong. Instead of them keeping the book going, they canceled the book, rebooted again with the same creative team. And once they did that, they killed all the sales momentum. And that's another problem with the comic book industry, is that they just keep killing their momentum. If you have something that is selling, you just keep pushing it and you continue to push it hard. And that's something I do here at SJS Direct. When I started to see Spinsterella sales doing well on Smashwords, that's when I launched Spellbound to talk about Matilda's baby bat years in the goth subculture. And when I had people who love Spellbound, I then started the legendary Mad Matilda to continue getting the momentum off the sales. And the same thing with my nonfiction books with the Simp trilogy. I started out with Stop Simpin', And then that book was doing well all over the world. And then I decided to come up with Manginas, and Manginas had over 1,000 downloads on Smashwords. And I decided, as I was writing Manginas, to do Misadventures of Captain Save-A-Ho. And that book also did well because people went from Stop Simping to Manginas to Misadventures of Captain Save-A-Ho. And then some even went to Why 70% of Black Women Are Single. That book kind of struggled for a minute, but then I put it free on Smashwords, and then that book started to build momentum. And from all of those men's issues books, you had people going from one book to the next book to the next book. Then I did Stop Simping in the Workplace. And then this year I did The Man Crisis. And I was writing the momentum from one book to the next. And that's what your comic book publishers are supposed to do. And that's what they used to do, because that's where I learned the model from, as related to my publishing business, was from comics. And when you have one book, you then follow it up with another book. And then you can not only get sales from the current book, but you can get backlist sales from the previous book. So I'm not seeing that type of understanding of how the business of publishing is going. And I'm not seeing that type of focus on trying to develop sales in the comic book industry. Melissa makes a good point. Tom King did ruin Batman. Yeah, he turned him into a complete beta male, because when I was sitting there online reading old issues of Batman, and I was reading some books in the 400s, some of the Max Collins Batman where they introduced Jason Todd, some of the Jim Starlin Batmans, and Batman was a far richer and more multidimensional character during those days where we had writers like Starlin and we had Max Collins writing Batman. And he was a richer and more multidimensional character. He had development, he had growth. We saw with Jason Todd that Bruce's emotions could possibly lead to him making bad decisions. And the same thing with Nightfall, because I believe that the whole block of 400s really showed all of the flaws in Batman, and they really showed how the Batman character grew. But instead of us going out here and focusing on that, we had writers wanting to retcon it here in the 2000s under Dan Dido, bringing back your Jason Todd, a character who I thought was better off dead, because all the growth in Batman that showed in those issues, that was all retconned away. And then we had all of these other things they did to Batman. And now Batman is not the character he once was. He's a pale shadow of his former self. And that's sad, because Batman was the best-selling comic in DC Comics, and he was also the best-selling comic in the comic book industry. And your Tom King has completely messed it up. And your Dan Dido, because he's not a publishing pro like myself, he's not going to pull this guy and say, look, the way you're writing Batman is not Batman. And if you can't write good action-oriented Batman stories that are character-driven, then I'm going to have to let you go. Instead, we have this obsession with giving Tom King 100 issues when, as I see it, he was done by Batman 50. And if I was an editor-in-chief, I would have pulled him by Batman 50 and brought in a seasoned talent to come in, because the way he was writing Batman was a complete mess. And yeah, Heroes in Crisis is one of the worst events in the history of comics. And I have to say, it's even worse than this War of the Realms Marvel is producing, and even worse than your Secret Empire. And when I look at Heroes in Crisis, War of the Realms, and Secret Empire, I see another big problem with the event model. Now, the event model back in the 1980s, it was designed to get people to pick up slower B and C list titles by tying them in to a major storyline. And it worked very well because it would get people to go out here and buy those comics because they wanted to try the story with the storyline. And if they liked it, they would continue to collect it. But what I see now with the event model is that it has become a complete crutch in the comic book industry. And it's something that editors are using to try to sell bad comics. And they're trying to use many comic fans' compulsion towards being completists to go out here and buy all the issues as a way to try to generate sales, And again, that's a very weak approach to business. And as a publisher, I wouldn't want to do that, because if the books can't carry themselves on their own, then as I see it, why keep publishing those books, and then why keep using this event model to try to get them over? Because over at DC, they're talking about this Leviathan event with Brian Michael Bendis, but your Brian Michael Bendis, as I've seen it, he's a complete failure at DC. Sales have gone down under him. People aren't buying these books, and he's a complete disaster as a writer over at DC. But he's been falling for a good decade now, and I look at a lot of his books, and I see a guy who doesn't want to do research, a guy who doesn't want to go out here and do what needs to be done, and he doesn't want to learn what he needs to do. And yeah, Hardcore H, I really hated Civil War. To me, Civil War, that was like a jump the shark moment for comic books and Marvel, because Civil War, it was, again, another one of those events that divided fans. And again, when you have divided fans, you're going to split your audience. And if you split your audience, you're not going to make money. And this is another thing that I see with ComicsGate and the so-called SJW Comics Pros, is that they are splitting the audience. And when you split an audience, you're not going to be able to build the word of mouth, and you're not going to be able to get people excited for your product. And if they can't get excited for your product, then you're not going to generate sales. And that's what I see what's happening with ComicsGate right now. They're more about arguing with SJW Comics Pros, making videos attacking SJW Comics Pros and what they call the SJW Comics Medium, instead of trying to build that bridge that gets people together and gets them excited about comics again, because that's what I want to do. I want to get people excited about comics. I want to get them really into going out here and reading comics again. And I want them to see what was great about those comics many of these movies are made of. Because in the days of 1989 with Batman, that was a phenomenon, because what happened with Batman, we had so many people who were excited about the movie. They were out here and they went to the comic shop and they saw the Batman in the comics. He may have been a different color and costume, but what they did was they went out here and they bought Batman comics, and that led to a major surge for DC's overall brand. So that was something that that's interesting, huh, Feezy? Yeah, they are declining in quality, and Richard Meyer pulls money, and these guys pull money, but the whole thing is the industry is not growing and changing. The whole thing is that, yeah, they're pulling money for their projects like the Pro Blacks would do for their documentaries and their book projects. They would get their money, but the whole thing is we don't see how that impacts the bigger business of the industry. I don't see how any comic shops are benefiting, and I don't see how people outside of a select group of readers are benefiting. Because what I wanted to do with the ISIS graphic novel is, after I did the Indiegogo, what I was going to do was create a print-on-demand version, because I wanted to get, again, the comic in the hands of readers. Because for me, the whole idea of just crowdfunding is not about creating a collector's edition that somebody just reads once and puts on the shelf. I want to create books that people read once and then continue to read again. Because for me, I want to make the type of books that you read until the cover comes off, or you're putting the cover back on with tape and glue, and you just continue to want to keep reading it. That's what I want to do with comics, and that's what I want to do with my books, is be able to give you the kind of books that make you go, hey man, I love that book so much, I want to read it again. I want to read it again and again and again, to the point where the cover comes off. So to me, that's what a great book is all about, and that's what great storytelling is all about. J.O. West, Marvel already redeemed Hank Pym years ago with the West Coast Avengers. So the whole thing is that a lot of these writers with Henry Pym is they keep trying to rehash an old story about Henry Pym hitting his wife. And Jim Shooter already talked about this. I read Jim Shooter's blog, and he said Henry Pym wasn't a woman beater. What happened was Henry Pym was under a lot of stress because of his inferiority complex, and that's why he struck Janet, because he was out of his mind at the time, because he wanted to be a better hero. But the irony is it started him on the road to decline. But that was already dealt with in issues of West Coast Avengers by Roger Stern, and it was also dealt with by John Byrne. Both of those writers, when you go pick up their runs, you'll see that they already redeemed Hank Pym way back in about 1986 or so. But because a lot of these terrible writers don't understand that story, which was also dealt with by Kurt Busiek in Ultron Imperative, it was all dealt with organically. But because these writers are so terrible these days, they keep rehashing this point instead of moving the Henry Pym character forward, because they don't know how to write this character and make him forward. Dark Soul Quee says, we went to the comic store. That was my thing back on Friday. I would go get my comics from Times Square, subway station, newsstand, and I would then later on at 3 o'clock I'd go get my pizza. So that was part of my routine. And the whole thing with Henry Pym is that they just decided they didn't know how to write. They just keep writing that character, rehashing him, because they don't know where they want to take the character forward. Now in West Coast Avengers, they were taking the character forward, and they helped grow him in a very constructive way. He almost was leader type material. I saw Blade in the Avengers, and that's another desperate attempt to get customers to buy the Avengers, which is starting to flounder. So they wanted to bring him in to try to say, oh, we're bringing in Blade, but I don't see how he fits organically on that team. You have to excuse me. So they didn't really fit him in organically into the Avengers. They just have him on this team, which is, as I see it, overloaded. You have Thor, Iron Man, Captain America, Doctor Strange, She-Hulk, Black Panther, and Ghost Rider. And again, I don't see how any of these characters synergize with each other. So when you're putting together a team, all the characters, they should synergize with each other, play off each other, and they should form a dynamic where each character brings an asset to the team. So I don't see anything outside with this Avengers team that flows organically. Hans Fizi, I've used Comixology in the past. I bought Josh Howard's T-Bird and Throttle there. I bought Zombie Tramp issues there, and I bought a couple of Dynamite titles there. It's an okay place to buy comics, but it's not one that I would prefer to use. I usually like to go straight to places like Dynamite and buy them and then download them in PDF, because when I buy them there, I own them outright. But with Comixology, they make it where in some cases you can't download your comics as PDFs, so you can't really own them. You just have hold of them. So that's one of the reasons I don't really like Comixology. That's right, Hardcore H. But the whole thing is they don't want to give black superheroes a son, because that means you're promoting patriarchy, and that's one model they don't want to promote in the comic book model in the comics, because they don't like the idea of seeing strong, masculine black men. So that's something they don't want to see as related to black men. Now, that's why they bring the daughters in, because they want to promote gynocentrism. They don't want to promote the idea of a father on screen, because having a black father on screen, that runs counter to what many of these companies want to push. So they don't want to push that, because if you look at Black Lightning, you could have given Black Lightning a son, but they didn't want to do that. They wanted to push their agenda. And I was not happy with what they did with the Legacy Heroes, Nightwing, Wally West, and Roy Harper with the Heroes in Crisis. they just messed those characters up. And that's one of the things that irked me about your Heroes in Crisis. You had all these characters starting to actualize their potential, especially guys like Nightwing. He was selling very well. You had Wally West, who was starting to grow as a character, and then you had Roy Harper, and then they just decided to kill them again because Dan Dido doesn't like legacy characters. And that's another problem I have with this industry, is a lot of the people here, it's all about what they want and not about giving the customer what they want. And when it comes down to DC, legacy heroes are a part of what DC is all about. And instead of your Dan Dido listening to the customer and following the history of DC with these legacy characters, he insists on making these characters he wants be the frame of the thing instead of letting the customers have that. Yeah, Super Sons was a great series by Peter Tomasi, but the whole thing was your Dan Dido wanted to bring Brian Michael Bendis in, and he decided, oh, I want to do things with my Superman run differently. So that book, again, lost its momentum, all because the people at DC weren't thinking about the sales numbers and the customer. They were only thinking about pleasing Brian Michael Bendis, something, again, no good editor-in-chief is going to do. They're going to show that creator the sales numbers. They're going to show you, look, this is where we are. What direction do you want to take us? And where do you want to go with these characters? And will it fit with what we want to do in the big picture? So it was really sad to see Super Sons lose all of their momentum due to bad editorial decisions. But this is, again, par for the course with Dan Dido. And again, shows me that people at DC really aren't about solutions. So, yeah, that's true. That DC is a mess. It's just a jumbled mess. People, they think Rebirth changed things, but it just made it even worse. And yeah, Doomsday Clock has not really paid off. It's like a lot of setup. The number 9 issue was supposed to be some sort of payoff for people, but as I see it, it's just really an underwhelming thing. It's like they keep trying to make it like Watchmen, but the big problem is, it's like the only way Doomsday Clock, as I see it, would pay off is if Jeff Johns made it as a way to bring back the old DC universe everybody wanted. And if he does that, that's going to give DC a possible win. But the big problem with DC is Dan Dido is still in charge. And as long as he's in charge, nothing really is going to change as related to DC. And the quality of DC's books under his leadership now is starting back on that downward trajectory it was before the New 52. Because before the New 52, we had him bringing in these dark stories like Identity Crisis, Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, Flashpoint. And we had this downward trajectory in sales because, again, the comic book customer does not want to be miserable. The comic book customer wants to go read comics because they want to get away from their problems, not have problems brought to them, nor do they want to see their friends murdered, mutilated, raped, and all sorts of horrific things done to them. They don't want to see these things, and that's why they don't go out and buy DC Comics. That's why sales have dropped for DC Comics over at least a 15-year period. Outside of the reboot spikes, we've seen these sales continuously drop, and we're starting to see them drop again with the introduction of Bendis and Batman 50 and the return to the Dan Dido deconstructionist dark story model. That deconstructionist dark story model, as I see it as a publisher, is an obsolete model. It just doesn't work anymore, just like the event model doesn't work anymore. And as I see it, many of the story models, many of these comic publishers, they don't work. And instead of them trying to create a new paradigm for storytelling, what we're seeing is them trying to hold on to these obsolete models that don't work anymore in terms of storytelling or in terms of sales, and still trying to continue to write in those story models that just don't work, and wondering why things don't work. Well, the definition of insanity is doing the exact same thing and expecting a different result. And when you do the exact same thing over and over again and still continue to expect a different result. The problem is not the characters, the problem is the creators and the editors, because in the hands of a competent creator, they can go out here and take those exact same characters and make them work. So I know that that's the big problem at DC, and it's the big problem at Marvel and many of these other companies. And I also know it's also the problem with many of the people in ComicsGate. They want to get change, but then they don't really want to get change. They want to talk about change, but nobody really wants to focus on the things that need to be changed. Now, as a publisher, I know what needs to be changed because I had to do it with my own SJS Direct imprint. When my customers tell me something is wrong, I listen to them and then I give them what they want, which is the biggest problem with, as I see it, comics today. The whole thing is that nobody wants to give the customer what they want. They want to tell you what you should have, and that doesn't work when it comes down to businesses that create products. So that's something that, as I see it, is the biggest problem with the comics, is that people keep wanting to give you what they want, and then they want to give you these archaic models that worked in the 80s today. Because when I hear people talking about Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, I say to myself, from a historical perspective, yes, those were groundbreaking stories in the 80s when I was a teenager, but here in 2019, those stories are over 30 years old. So you're trying to sell people in the 21st century a 20th century story that is over 30 years old, a story model that is over 30 years old, and a story that doesn't really reflect what's going on today. And that's why the books just aren't selling on the DC side, whereas on the Marvel side, we have something going on where they want to try to force feed us identity politics and then push this whole narrative with these self-centered characters. And that's not going to work because people have to identify and relate with characters in order to buy their work. And if they don't identify and relate with the characters, they don't want to buy their stories. And that's starting to, again, trickle into the movies now, because I'm now starting to see with Spider-Man Homecoming, I started to see that's come in there. And with many of the DC movies, like Man of Steel, Dawn of Justice, and Batman v Superman, I'm starting to see the exact same thing go on over there. And I'm now with this Captain Marvel, and I believe with these other Marvel movies, I'm starting to see what they call SJW cancer starting to infest there. Good morning, Chris. Chris Brown is the writer of Omega Black, a very great comic book that everybody should read. Omega Black is African-American manga, very well done. The first 2 issues are on Comixology, and you can pick them up there. I picked them up, and I loved both of them, and I'm hoping that he can get number 3 out. He's got an Indiegogo for that, just like I have an Indiegogo for the ISIS graphic novel. And you can pledge to the ISIS graphic novel Indiegogo. What I want to do, again, is go out here and create a fun, family-friendly comic, just like the books in my SJS Direct imprint. And you can pledge to pick that one up today by clicking the link in the chat. I'm going to put another link in the description box. Chris, I want to make sure everybody knows about Omega Black because it's one of the best mangas I have seen out there, and it's very well done. These brothers have really put together a great comic, and I want people to go out here and read it because, as I see it, great comics need to get word of mouth, and that's something, again, I don't see ComicsGate out here doing on the regular. Now, when I do videos, I would go out here to, again, if I see a great comic, I'm going to tell people about that great comic, like I did with Dan Mendoza's Zombie Tramp. It's a little hardcore adult, but it's a great comic. And also, I did it with Josh Howard's T-Bird and Throttle, another great comic. And if I see great comics, I'm going to let people know about it because, again, I want to see people not buying comics to bag and board. I want to see people buying comics till they read them till the covers come off. That's the type of readership I want, and that's the type of readership I want for my books. Yeah, I heard about Eternals, and that's where I say it's just time for me to walk away from the MCU, because when I look at what Disney is doing to the MCU, it is very similar to what your SJW Marvel is doing in their books. So if they want to produce that type of material, I'm not going to spend money on it, nor am I going to even think about making videos about it. At this point, when I look at this industry, again, I'm about getting change. I'm not about continuing to go back and forth with people and continuing to complain about products. I'm just going to do what regular people do who aren't comic fans and just start ignoring the products that I don't like. Because as I see it, the time in my life is precious, and I don't want to waste any more time dealing with products that are complete garbage. So if they want to make an Eternals with a gay lead, I don't have to spend money on it. And if they want to bring Riri Williams and these other characters, I don't need to spend money on it. I heard about Harley Quinn, Melissa, and it breaks my heart to hear what they did to that character. Harley Quinn was a fun character when she was in Batman, the animated series, but they have just turned her into a complete mess. And she's basically become a Mary Sue character for people pushing their own agendas and pushing their feminist ideals, and her book has completely fallen apart. So her character was a great character, but it just is another textbook example of what happens when you have a bad creator get a hold of a very good character. And that's one of the other big problems that I have on the side with these so-called SJW comics pros, is they take these great characters, and because a lot of these people have no experience in publishing or writing, they destroy these characters and make them complete messes from what they originally were. When I look at what they did to many of these characters at Marvel and at DC, it reminds me of something I think about as related to hiring a bunch of McDonald's workers to work in a gourmet restaurant. Now, a bunch of McDonald's workers, they aren't used to working with gourmet food, and they get these high-end food items, and they don't know how to cook, so they make a complete mess of things because they don't understand, flavors, flavor combinations. They don't understand technique of cooking, and they don't have any understanding of standards. So when these people get a hold of some gourmet food like langoustines, I remember when I was working at Food Emporium, because that was my first job, was working at Food Emporium. Things like blood oranges and things that, top cuts of meat like New York strip, and you watch them try to cook this stuff, they make a complete mess of everything because they don't have the specialized training to understand how these cuts of meat work, how these ingredients work, how these flavors work. And they try to make their own flavors and they make a mess. Whereas a gourmet chef, you put him in a fast food restaurant, he's going to take those same ingredients because he has the skill set and the technique and the training. He's going to make something that's amazing. And what's really sad is nobody's going to appreciate the gourmet chef, because the people who eat fast food, they're not here for gourmet flavors. And the people who make the fast food and you put them in a gourmet restaurant, they're going to look at it and get disgusted. And that's what I see going on with the comic book industry, is that you have these poorly trained people. They're here like fast food workers, and they're trying to work with these gourmet ingredients, and they don't have the craftsmanship, the skills, or the technique. And that's why many of their comics, like Travis is saying, reads like a bad fan fiction and not a well-crafted story. Because last week when I was reading Magnificent Miss Marvel #1, that's what the whole book read like. It read like an absolutely terrible fan fiction piece. It didn't read like a well-crafted story. It didn't really bring me into the character or make me care about the character. It was all a piece to please Sana Amanat's ego, because Ms. Marvel is her avatar, and it's all to tell a story that reflects what she wants to see her avatar do in the Marvel universe, be this savior, but it doesn't give us a hero who learns anything or grows from the experience. So it's not about giving the reader any sort of story. It's all about creating a kind of comic that just is a vanity piece. That's something that I used to see back in the 1980s from many of these black and white publishers. And these black and white publishers, they would produce these absolutely terrible comics. And these comics were so bad that, you know, they used to get roasted all the time back in the 1980s, but people understood why they were bad because a lot of these people who were doing the comics, they didn't have any experience. They didn't have any training. They did not really do that much reading of comics. They didn't do that much reading of literature. And that's why their books were so terrible. What's sad here is that we get people who say that they're coming in, like your Mariko Tamakis and your Gabby Rivera's, who say that they have publishing experience and that they have written YA books. And again, because they don't have training and nobody takes time to train them, they come out here with their one credit, and one book is just not enough experience to really understand how books work or how stories work. Even with the best editor, you need to have at least 3 or 4 under your belt to really understand how books work and how stories work. And you also have to read books like Sid Field's screenplay and Robert McKee's story to really understand storytelling. But I'm not seeing that type of craft, you know, in the comic book industry. And again, that's being reflected on the page. And there is no real, again, focus on from the ComicsGate side or the so-called SJW Comics Pros towards improving the quality so that we can get the readership. And then on the publisher side, whenever we see a book starting to get momentum, like a Peter Tomasi's Super Sons or Jurgens and Tomasi Superman, the book starts to get momentum, we see the publishers like Dan Dido become their own worst enemy, canceling books that sell and going out here and removing creative teams from books that are selling. And again, that just shows how they're their own worst enemy, because any publisher who is seeing positive sales numbers, they're going to keep pushing towards making sure that those sales numbers go from 40,000 to 80,000 to 120,000, because if the numbers go up, it shows that things are going in the right direction. Because when I go out here and publish books, that's what I want to do. I want to make my numbers go up from, 20 or 30 books being sold all the way up to 100 books, to 1,000 books, to 10,000 books, because that to me is the way I see how you get success. Because the more readers buying your work, the more word of mouth you're building, and that word of mouth turns into new sales of new books, and it also turns into sales of back books. And that's how the publishing business works. You have the front list titles. If they are serialized, they are not only selling the next book, but they're also selling the backlist books. And when I look at the comic book industry, the backlist is completely collapsed, because if you're selling books in clearance stores like Five Below, that shows that you cannot, if your front list books are not moving the backlist. And this is the big problem that your ComicsGate also is not addressing. They'll make videos talking about, how all these books are in these clearance stores, but they don't really, again, because they're not publishing professionals, they don't understand how dire that is. And when you have backlist books, trade paperbacks that are being sold for $5, you have things are not they're not bad, they're dire, because that means you're not moving backlist books, because a frontlist book is supposed to move a backlist book. If you have a frontlist book, like right now, I have Isis All That Glitters on Amazon right now. When I launched that book on March 25th, that frontlist book is supposed to move some of the backlist books. And that happened to me with many of the ISIS series books. And then again, it also happened with The Man Crisis. The Man Crisis also sold Stop Simpin', Manginas, Misadventures of Captain Savaho, Why 70% of Black Women Are Single. And that's what a healthy publisher's business looks like. Front list book sells the backlist book, and it also builds anticipation for the next book. But with this comic book industry, like Killer Red has made a statement, the reboots have killed the back issues, and it's also killed backlist sales. These reboots, these retcons, they he also makes a good point that I've made. What's the point of going to start if the issues don't mean anything? And that's what a lot of casual readers have been saying about things. And even one comic shop owner in Florida, he was complaining about it. And he brought up a lot of points that I talked about in an ebook I made called An Analysis of the Comic Book Industry's Business Issues over 8 years ago. And what's sad is I wrote this over 8 years ago, and I wrote this in blogs talking about how bad things were going to get 8 years ago. And back then, people dismissed me. But these days, we are starting to see where the problem is with the comic book industry. And a lot of people, these comic shop owners, they're starting to see those same problems go on right now. So I look at things, and I said that there were problems here 8 years ago, and I proposed solutions to those problems 8 years ago. But as I see it now, nobody is interested in being focused on solutions. They just want to continue arguing about the problem. And that's not how you move forward. When you move forward, you acknowledge the problem. And then after you acknowledge the problem, you start working towards solutions. But as I see it, many of the people in the industry and many of these comic skaters, they are caught up in arguing with each other and getting attention from arguing that they aren't really focused on doing anything constructive. And that's right, Travis. That's why manga is beating comics, and that's why manga may even take over comics, because manga is doing something I did back in 2011 when I shifted to ebooks. They are offering free books to get readers incited. And one of the things when you offer a free book is that once the reader sees how good the book is, they then go out here and buy more books. Because that's what I did back in 2011 when I came to Smashwords and I started doing ebooks on Kindle. I started offering ebooks for free on those platforms. And because I was offering ebooks for free on those platforms, what people would do is they would go into the backlist and buy the books that I previously published because they saw what they liked in that book that they got for free. And that would give them incentive to go out here and buy more books. So manga is doing something I did over 8-9 years ago, and it was successful for me. And I believe it's going to be very successful for them, because if Shonen Jump gives you this app that gives you access to all of their old books for free for just a $2 subscription, they are going to put a nail in the coffin for your comic book industry, because nobody is really, again, focused on trying to get stories in readers' hands. It's all either about agenda or it's about arguing, and it's not about getting product in the customer's hands so they can go out here and enjoy the stories. Yeah, that's a good point, Hardcore H. Well, the whole thing is that manga is more run like a business than the comic book industry, and people have they have skills, and they also have training. So when it comes down to manga, they have a standard for their product, but I'm not seeing that standard with American stuff. Now, Chris Brown's Omega Black, that has a really great standard, and it's just like old school. It's just like manga from Japan. It's very well done, very well crafted, no identity politics. And again, I recommend you go get Omega Black, because it's one of the best mangas out there produced by an American. It's just rock solid. And you definitely have to pick that one up. But when I look at the modern comic book business, it's just not following the standards that manga is following. They want to push things like your Harley Quinn being a lesbian, Wonder Woman being bisexual, which does not make sense because in the original Wonder Woman, she was in love with Steve Trevor, and that was always a core point of her story. So again, they do this to try to, Dan Dido tries to shock people with this, but it doesn't bring in the readers. Yes, it'll get you an article on a web page. It'll get you an article with a website, but it will not get you sales, because what you want to do is give your core audience good stories, because again, the good stories are going to get the word of mouth. You might get a little press by announcing, oh, so-and-so is gay, so-and-so is bisexual, but that's not going to get you money in the long run. It's not going to get you money, and it's not going to get you readers. It's not going to bring people to buy your product. What's going to get people buying your product is them seeing how solid it is, because that's what's going to get you the word of mouth. I'm going to but word of mouth is what you want, and I'm not seeing any focus on word of mouth, because when I would do again positive reviews of comics, that was all about getting word of mouth to people about quality comics. It was about getting those readers, those creators, the sales, because I understand that comics cost a lot of money to create, and they cost a lot of money to distribute. They also cost a lot of money to print. So a publisher, they're putting at least $25,000, $30,000 on the table when they publish a comic. And a lot of times what I'm seeing right now is nobody's focused on things as related to marketing and business and helping people, get these books to the table. And that was supposed to be one of those things ComicsGate was supposed to be all about, making sure that good comics wind up in the hands of readers. But I'm not seeing any sort of push on that. Instead, all I'm seeing again is this bickering and back and forth with so-called SJW comics pros. And to me, that's not what's supposed to be all about. If you really care about comics, you want to see good comics in the hands of people, and you want to see good comics being shared with people, and you want to see, again, comics getting out there and people finding these comics, because that's how we start making those baby steps towards reviving interest in comics during a period when superhero movies are at an all-time high. And everybody's thinking that they could, because I think a lot of people have this 1990s mindset. They're thinking that one big comic is going to try to bring the whole thing back. And I'm sorry, that's just not going to happen. There is not going to be some magic bullet comic that's going to come out from an American publisher that's going to bring back American comics. A lot of people are thinking they can do an Amazing Fantasy 15, a Fantastic Four #1, a Giant Size X-Men #1. They're thinking that they can bring everything back with this one book. And I look at that and I say, no, that's not going to happen, because in many cases, that first book usually does not sell well. Usually it takes a couple of months before you can start getting that word of mouth, which will generate the momentum. So yeah, Giant Size X-Men was published in 1975, but I don't believe Marvel really felt anything as related to the X-Men sales until about 1977 or late 1976, because usually it takes a couple of months for readers to get into a book, and then by then, that's when you start seeing the increase in sales. It doesn't happen automatically and immediately, and that's something a lot of people, they're thinking, oh, it's going to happen like the days of Spider-Man #1 by Todd McFarlane, or the days of Jim Lee X-Men #1. But I'm sorry, as a publishing professional, I can tell you that does not happen. Even with books with anticipation, it does not happen. I mean, I remember a couple of months ago when I launched The Man Crisis, that book, it had some decent sales from the start, but it really did not start getting surges in sales until the word of mouth started. And then I started doing advertising with Sandman and Obsidian, and I started getting good reviews on it. And that's when and then the Judge Joe Brown show, I really started to seeing really serious momentum with the Man Crisis. And the thing that keeps books selling is really, after you do the promotion, the word of mouth, because that means people are reading it and then they are sharing it. And this is something that people don't really understand with comics. They're expecting, again, the magic bullet to come along, and that they're expecting that to happen, and it's not going to happen. So that's what a lot of people are thinking. Oh, it's going to turn around. We're going to get this one great book, and that's why they keep rebooting to these new #1 issues. They keep thinking, oh, if we do this new #1, it's going to bring people. No, but it brings speculators in, and what the speculators do is they buy these books, they bag and board them, and then they use them for investment purposes. And then the same thing with the variant cover people. They think that they're going to go out here and get this big payday. And what they do is wind up disappointed about 4 or 5 years later when they find out this book is absolutely worthless, because there is no story in this book that will get the customer excited about buying the newest issues or buying the back issues. So they're sitting there going and wondering why it doesn't work. But the thing is, you're going around and coming around. And yeah, that's a really sad Code Ref. I heard about Joe Sinnott retiring at 92 years old, and that was something that was really sad. And we've lost a lot of icons like Steve Ditko. We lost Stan Lee last year, and many of the great comic creators are getting old. They're retiring. Many have passed away, and that's really one of the troubling things, because without those old veteran pros, there's nobody really there to teach craft anymore. And that's one of the things you can learn from a seasoned professional, is things as related to craft and storytelling. Because an older professional, they've been there, they've made the mistakes, they've failed, they've had the books that have failed. Like, I've had books that I've launched that didn't do well, and they're there to sit down and teach. And that's something that I see at a lot of the younger guys aren't getting, especially the guys who are really passionate. They really need that veteran to be there. And when you have people, again, you had Joe Sinnott, he's 92 years old and he's retiring. You have John Romita, who's in his 80s, and Roy Thomason, who's in their 80s. We have a lot of our veteran pros, they're just passing away. There's nobody there to really teach that craft to people, because that's one of the things I learned over the years as reading books about screenwriting and reading books about the novel and reading books about comics, is I learned this craft. And craft is something that you learn by being hands-on. You can't really learn craft in school. You can go to school for things like art and stuff like that, but craft is something that you just learn hands-on, and it's something that usually one mentor passes on to their pupil overall, because that's how wrestlers learn the craft in the ring. They learn the craft from other wrestlers. So that's why we used to watch with Vince McMahon back in the day. He used to have the veteran wrestler, and he would have the rookies take on the veteran, and that's how they would learn their craft in the ring. And this is something that we're not seeing anymore. Yeah, and I heard about Alan Moore and George Perez retiring, and that was something that is really sad. I mean, I wanted to make a video about George Perez because he was one of my favorite artists, and I didn't have the time to do it. But we're seeing these veterans walk away, and nobody really focused on what they do. And yeah, Static doesn't get the what he deserves at DC, and they've just buried him, and they've buried all the Milestone characters. There was all this talk about Milestone coming back, yet we have not seen anything as related to any new Milestone issues being launched or announcement of Milestone issues being launched. And it's been, what, 2-3 years now? I'm sitting there going, we should have had a announcement of books and nothing has come. And yeah, Killer Red was talking about the variant cover days, and we're back to that now. We have all these comic pros. They are continuing to push this variant covers. I remember looking online, they said there was a variant called Director's Cut of the Magnificent Ms. Marvel, but I looked at it, I said, you have all these variant covers, but variant covers don't sell books to readers. When it comes down to comics, this is a big problem. They're trying to sell books to speculators and collectors, whereas a guy like me, I want to sell books to readers because readers are how you make money. That's how you get customers to keep coming back, because these variant books, yeah, the comic shop owners, what they do is they'll order 500 to get that one in 1,000 copy, and they'll wind up getting stuck with all these books. But because they're stuck with the inventory, what happens is they wind up getting stuck with this inventory, which causes them to have losses. And this is one of the core reasons why these shops are closing, is this thing where they're trying to sell these variant book covers to these comic shops and not trying to sell books to readers. And that's another problem that we have in the industry, is because nobody's focused on solutions. And the other problem is they're focused on selling comics to comic shops and not selling comics to comics readers. And that's one of the things, again, I wanted to address with my Indiegogo for the graphic novel, was trying to sell comics to readers by using the print-on-demand platforms to create a place for comics to be sold to the reader directly, where they can, after the Indiegogo, after everybody gets theirs from the Indiegogo, they would get theirs, and then we would switch over to print-on-demand platform, where people could go get the books and then have them shipped, printed and shipped directly to them. And there would be the way they could just get the books just like that. That was one of the things I wanted to do as related to the business model, because I believe that the business model for print comics is changing. And because it's changing, we need to focus on a platform that will allow the books to continue to be sold, and also give us a measure to see how well these books are doing. Rudy, I don't really have a list of non-identity politic comic writers, but I can tell you that Chris Brown's Omega Black has no identity politics. Josh Howard's Two-Bird and Throttle has no identity politics. Mike Williams' Deke Sledge online comic strip has no identity politics. And a lot of guys who are making comics, they're making comics without identity politics out there. Bill Walko's Hero Business has no identity politics. They're all great comics, and they're great comics that really people need to take a look at, because these guys are really working hard, putting together some great books, and they're putting together great web comics. And yeah. But yeah, Hanfizi, when it comes down to print on demand, I see that as the future for comics, because the stores, as I see it, they're not going to be sustainable much longer. And I don't see the stores being much sustainable, because they are all caught up in this whole speculator thing where they're trying to order comics, and then you have Marvel over shipping comics. And you have shops closing as a result of this vicious cycle. So print on demand, as I see, is going to be a major future for comic books, because when it comes down to print on demand, people, when they buy a comic, it's printed on request. And for the publisher, it gives you a measure of what is selling in real time, because whenever I go to a KDP on Amazon, I see what is selling in real time. And that tells me, oh, if this book is getting such and such numbers on Kindle, or if it's getting this such and such sales on paperback, that tells me, okay, this book is selling, so I need to push this book, or this book I launched is not selling, so I need to stop producing this book. So when I have real-time numbers, it gives me an indicator to what is selling. I do remember the free trading card hustle. I actually have several Marvel Universe cards. I have Marvel Universe Series 2, Marvel Universe Series 3, and I have Marvel Masterpieces Series 1. So I remember the trading card hustle. And I collected quite a few of them. So I have a few of them in my collection. I actually, Rudy, I'm gonna elaborate on that whole Civil War argument in Friday's live stream. I'm gonna do an entire Friday live stream on the man crisis, and I'm gonna talk about the whole Civil War thing in that live stream. So I'm gonna address that on Friday night's live stream. But this one, I'm gonna talk mostly again about this whole ComicsGate situation, because as I see it, the situation is deteriorating, and it's more again about people getting in these back and forths and getting YouTube views, and it's not about getting comics in the hands of readers. Because again, if this is about getting better stories, that should be the primary focus. Because if you're all about getting good stories in people's hands, good stories are how we're going to sell more comics, and that's what I want to see done. But I don't see that being done. Again, all I see is a lot of arguing, a lot of back and forth, and a lot of people looking for YouTube views and not thinking about really getting this industry back on its feet. For me, I want to see the industry get back on its feet. I want to see people starting to grow, and I want to see people, see comics as something they want to read. That's what I want to see with everything, because if it's about moving us forward, we should be focused on moving forward. And I don't see anything moving forward. Instead, I see things getting worse instead of getting better. And I thought that's, again, what the ComicsGate was supposed to be all about. I thought it was supposed to be about solutions. But again, like the pro-black, it's all about just continuing to talk in circles about the problem and not really deal with the problem. Yeah, I'm going to talk about all that in the Man Crisis Part 2 one that I'm going to do, Rudy. I'm going to talk about how men are going MGTOW in the workplace and Silicon Valley and Wall Street. I'm going to talk about all that in the Friday night live stream. I'm going to talk in depth about that. This one's about to wrap up in about 10 minutes. But those are the things that I want to see, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to support ComicsGate in the past. But when I look at it now, I see it as a thing that I can't really support now, because if you're not about really getting change and working towards change, then it's a waste of my time. And as I see it, my time is precious. I don't want to waste my time. Moreover, I don't want to waste money working with people who don't really want solutions. So those two resources are precious to me, and I don't want to waste them, my time doing things to try to help people who don't want help. And I want to work with those people who actually want help and actually want to work towards change. I want to work with people to want to move this industry forward, and I really want to work towards developing a business model that will get comics in the hands of people if we lose too many more comic shops. Because at this point, we have lost a lot of comic shops, and if we don't have any more comic shops, what's going to happen is you're going to reach a point where there's not enough people to get minimum orders, and that's going to really impact the industry. Because that's why we're starting to see this DC implosion right now, that they're cutting back on their titles because there are too many titles, and the audience of readers has shrunk to the point where there isn't enough demand to sustain the supply. And over at DC and Marvel, again, your Dan Dido is doing this because he's got a personal jab at DC, but this is not about business overall. So as a business person, I always said that there were too many titles in comics. And I said this about 8-9 years ago. I said a healthy publisher's catalog of ongoing books should only be about 24, 25 books. And the reader should be able to pick up all of those books for at least maybe a $50 bill today or a $100 bill. And they should be able to pick up all those books in a month if they're staggered and tiered out. If you want to go and be a completist, and you should be able to get them all in a month affordably, and the whole thing should be accessible. So, but I'm not seeing any efforts towards, really focusing on developing a business model that will ensure that comics are able to come out on a monthly basis or a bi-weekly basis. All I'm seeing, again, is, Dan Dido, he comes out with this 100-page books that are sold at Target and Walmart with reprint material. And then over at Marvel, they're just trying to flood the shelves with lots of books. And that's passive aggressive because you're flooding the shelves with lots of books, but there's no quality. So you're actually hurting the overall business. And again, none of this stuff is dedicated to solutions and helping the customer, find your product, or trying to work towards developing distribution that will help the customer find the product. Killer Red, they used to get A-list artists who would finish their work every month. These days, a lot of people's work ethic is so bad that you give them a project, and a lot of them, they have lost their passion and their heart. They don't really care about finishing their work. And that's why we're seeing these erratic pencils from one artist on the start of a run all the way to, we're seeing 3 and 4 pencilers in a 3-issue story arc. And that's another troubling sign, because it's a sign that editorial is not pushing towards imposing standards. It shows that editorial doesn't care, because if you have A-list talent that is saying that they can't finish work on time, then there has to be some sort of remedy for that. Because I think one of the reasons why a lot of them, because I've heard from artists who've said this, a lot of them, they will, slow their work down because they're not being paid. And again, if you're a billion-dollar publisher, you should be making sure that your artists are paid. You should be making sure that your artists are taken care of, because whenever I do a cover, I always make sure I have the money ready for that cover before I even contact an artist. And that's something I do because I know that this artist's time is precious and their work is valuable, their labor is valuable. So I want to make sure that I give them make sure that their money is ready, so that we're ready to take care of business. And that's something that I'm not seeing. And that's why I believe we're seeing all these erratic one penciler. He's taking this time, and then they have to bring in another one. But I'm not seeing any sort of editorial leadership or any sort of standard. And again, that's another problem that, again, ComicsGate has not really talked about. And that's another problem that the industry is not really dealing with, because if you cannot get an artist to be able to produce a book in a consistent pattern or consistent schedule, then your standards have fallen completely off. Yeah, Joe Mad fell off, but his work ethic fell off. But now he's got a lot of commercial work. Melissa, I talked about Second Coming in a video, and I talked about that book and how blasphemous it was, and how DC was this close to having a major scandal. And that's one of the reasons why they gave the rights back, because this book was going to be as bad as the O.J. Simpson If I Did It. Now, when they did O.J. Simpson's If I Did It, you had Judith Regan, who thought, oh, this book is going to be controversial, it's going to get a lot of press. But instead of getting press, it got negative press, and it got a backlash, and they literally had to wind up eating millions of dollars in cost as a result of If I Did It. And Second Coming was going to be that bad, because we had all of these Christians, they were upset about this book and making this insulting statement about Jesus coming back. And this was a real slap in the face to these Warner Brothers core customer base. And your Dan Dido decided to just give them the rights back rather than have to deal with the scandal. But it also shows, again, his inept leadership at DC Comics and the completely inept leadership at Vertigo Comics, an imprint that has been a complete disaster from day one. And when I look at the publications coming out of your Vertigo, it was a complete mess. And again, that has to do with editorial not taking the lead, not establishing a mission, and not establishing a standard for their product. And that was the big problem with Vertigo. You had this 25th anniversary launch, and nothing was focused on making sure that if you're going to relaunch this, it's going to be consistent with the original mission of Vertigo Comics, which is about giving creators creative freedom to explore new concepts and new story models, or hiring craftsmen like they did back then, like your Garth Ennis's and your Grant Morrisons, to go out here, and your Neil Gaimans to go out here and create well-crafted stories. It was all about just making these identity politics comics. And the first scandal to do them in was your Eric Esquivel. And one of the things that I found quite troubling with it, with a lot of these comic skaters, is they'll give your James Gunn a pass, but then they were all upset and emotional, and were all about saying, "Oh, Eric Esquivel, he should go away." But I look at that as another double standard. You want to give James Gunn a complete pass for making the movie Guardians of the Galaxy 3 that you want, but your Eric Esquivel, who was writing a comic, Border Town, that you didn't like, you wanted to see this man fired. And again, that is a complete double standard. And Code Ref makes a good point. Yeah, you might get away with Second Coming with a Marvel crowd, but the DC crowd is far more conservative. And that's something, again, you weren't going to get away with, because the DC fans, they just weren't going to have that. And Warner Brothers, they weren't going to have that either, because the story, it was getting ready to become national news. And if it had become national news, that would have destroyed DC, because at this point right now, DC Comics sales are at an all-time low. And the people who were signing the petition against Second Coming, they were about 100,000. And right now, all of the DC Comics combined don't get 100,000 sales. So this would have put the nail in the coffin for the entire DC Comics brand. So the orders that these books get are lower than 100,000 people. And here in New York, an entire neighborhood in the Bronx is 100,000 people. So that's how bad things are. But nobody wants to work towards solutions, because some people want to continue getting away with producing poor quality comics. Others want to continue arguing about poor quality comics. And no one wants to focus on improving the quality of the comics. You have people who want to do fundraising to get their comics out there, but they're not focused on expanding the audience base or creating business models to get comics in the hands of readers. And that's something that's a problem. Yes, Devon, that's a juggernaut in the background. I had that one for a year. That's one of my family members gave that to me. But we're not seeing any sort of plan to get comics in the hands of customers, or get customers to learn about the products. What do I think about Star Wars? I've pretty much written Star Wars off. At this point, I don't think it's fixable. The damage was done with Force Awakens. After seeing Force Awakens and Last Jedi, the entire Star Wars franchise is damaged beyond repair. And the Skywalker saga, that was the core foundation of Star Wars. If that doesn't work, nothing works as related to Star Wars. And they did irreparable damage to the whole Star Wars story, this whole Skywalker saga. The third part just is damaged beyond repair. I mean, when they had a chance to put Luke, Han, and Leia in one movie, and they should have done that the first movie, and they should have reestablished that connection, and they didn't make that effort to do that. Yeah, that's Apocalypse in the background. Those are all villains on the printer. Yeah, that's Doom, Dr. Doom, Mystique, Apocalypse, Tiger Shark, Omega Red, and the Cobra. I mean to put those on the shelf, but I haven't had the time to, because I've been busy with live streams. I'm working on a new ISIS series story called ISIS the Main Event, which is in the world of women's wrestling. And that one is inspired by the TNA knockouts, the WWE divas, and the gorgeous ladies of wrestling and the women of wrestling, the WOW women of wrestling from the early 2000s. And it's also meant to try to give people a better understanding and insight into the world of professional wrestling. And that's a story I'm working on now. And right now I'm doing editing on John Haynes, The Man Who Has Nothing to Lose. So I have a very busy schedule that I've been, working on. I don't know about the site AnakinWorld.com, but I just know that though after they did the damage, they killed Han Solo, they killed Luke Skywalker, and they brought in these new characters. I have no interest in Star Wars. I saw the. Am I going to make Isis and E-Steam action figures? I made some customs way back a couple of years ago. If I could, if I had the money, Hans Fizi, I would have made those figures years ago. But I just don't have the sales. I need to have more sales if I hope to get the capital to do that type of project or get the licensing to do that type of project. So if I were to sell more Isis and E-Steam books, I could go out here and then start talking about making merchandising like Isis and E-Steam figures. But I did make some customs about 12, 13 years ago. It was 2003 or so. So it's about, those figures are about 16 years old, and I still have them, but I may show them in another video. But I would love to make those figures for people if I could just get the sales up, because I need the sales in order to do things. I heard about Alternate Comics Black Sand and their distribution, but as I see it, the thing that everybody needs to focus on is print on demand, because with print on demand and digital, that is how you're going to sell books, because print on demand, again, gives you that indicator to what's selling. So you have indicators that people can't manipulate, and you have indicators that let people know in real time what is selling and how fast it's selling. Because when I would look at my reports on Kindle Direct Publishers or even Lightning Source, I had real-time numbers that let me know how a book was doing. And if I got reviews from people and emails from people, I knew how that book would sell in the marketplace, and if I needed to go out here and launch another project. And what's happening now with comics, because comics aren't returnable, we don't have those indicators on things. Yeah, Han Fizi, I get the daily sales. That's one of the things I get right now. I haven't seen Rogue One, and I don't know if I want to see it, but I'll take a look. I might take a look at it if it's still on Netflix, but I might take a look at Rogue One. But yeah, I get daily sales on Smashwords. I also get them on Barnes & Noble, and I also get them on Amazon. And that's something that print on demand gives you. And it also gives you the whole thing with drop shipping. And drop shipping is another thing that I believe could help the comic book industry, because when you have a book that's ordered and it's drop shipped, what's going to do is, what's up, Benny G? Glad to see that you're here. You have a book that's drop shipped, it's shipped directly to the customer. And because it's shipped directly to the customer, it's packaged in a way that protects the material. Because a lot of the books that I would get, because I just recently got a new copy of, let's see if I can find it. Oh, here it is, right in front of me. So I just got a new copy of Isis All About the Goddess with the new cover. And this was drop shipped to me. And it came in a padded envelope. It was well protected. And this is a new cover by Tony Quaid. And you can get a good look at it. This one was drop shipped to me. And this was, again, a lot of my readers, this is how they get my books. They get them drop shipped to them. And that's something that I would want to see for the customer, because it means you're going to get a book that is well protected. It means you're going to get a book that's in pristine condition. And that's what I got with the All About the Goddess book in the mail. You can see that this is the new art, and this is also on Amazon right now. I would do Funko Pops of Isis and E-Steam if I had the chance. Again, if they would allow me to do the licensing, I would do the Funko Pops if I would get the sales up and the numbers up. But in order for me to do that, again, I need to get the sales. So if you guys go to Amazon and buy the books, that will help in the long run with me doing things like licensing and merchandising, because in order for me to go to companies or for them to come to me, I have to have the numbers. And if they see the numbers, that's going to give them incentive to come to me to do a licensed product. And that's something I would love to do if customers want it, because in order to do these products, you have to have molds, and those molds cost money. So those are all things that have to be done. I'm going to get ready to wrap the stream up in about a minute or so, because I have some stuff that I need to do. Yeah, I would love to see that, Melissa. But again, I East Team and the Goddess Next Door, but I need to see the money, and I need to see the sales on things like the books in the ISIS series. Right now, I have All That Glitters and East Team Goddess Of in paperback. So whenever if you pick the paperbacks up, that helps out a lot. And I have the digital versions of All That Glitters is coming out next week on the 25th. And East Team Goddess Of will be coming out in April. And I'm getting Goddess Of ready for digital launch. That's pre-order is going to be up in a couple of days. So I'm trying to get stuff out. But if you guys want Funko Pops and stuff like that, again, I need to see the sales so that Funko can contact me, because if I can't get the sales, then Funko doesn't contact me for licensed merchandising and products. Going to get ready to wrap this stream up in a minute or so. But I thank everybody for coming out to the live stream. And as a comic fan, again, I am very passionate about getting solutions to the reader. That was one of the reasons why I wrote the script for the All That Glitters graphic novel. I wanted to give people a textbook model and example of what a fun, all ages, family-friendly comic would look like. I wanted to give people a model for what a great comic had in it, and with featuring a strong heroine. And I wanted to give people the same high-quality story that I featured in All That Glitters, the ISIS series book, in the comic. I wanted to give them a quality adaptation, and that's what you'll get in the Indiegogo if you pledge to it on the comic book one. So that's the comic I want to produce, and that's the comic I want to share with you. And I'm going to leave a link to that again in the chat. Thank you, DBG Side 1965, for the donation. I really appreciate it. And you guys can pick up if you want. You can pick up ISIS All That Glitters on Amazon.com in paperback, or you can get the ebook on March 25th. And you can pick up East Team Goddess Of in paperback right now. And you can pick up ISIS All About the Goddess with the brand new cover from Tony Quaid right now. All of those books are available right now. I thank you again for your time. It's taking time with me out of your day. Friday night's live stream will be all about the man crisis. And in that one, I'm going to go further in depth on the man crisis and Civil War. So I hope you'll be there for that one. And I hope you'll pledge to the Indiegogo for the ISIS All That Glitters graphic novel. We're at $360 out of $25,000. We still have a long way to go. And I can only get this book out with your support. But again, I thank you again for taking time with me for today's live stream. I hope to see you on Friday.